Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy for part 1 of our series on AP government. So let's start with the basics. What is the government? Your textbook will probably define government as the institutions that create public policy. And public policies are the plans governments create and implement that are intended to help the people. And the essential questions that we will be asking ourselves throughout this course are, how are we, or should we, be governed? And what should the government do? As we will see, these questions have no clear answers and have been debated throughout U.S. history. We are all affected by government in a wide variety of ways. Governments decide at what age young adults can drive or drink alcohol, what roads, bridges, and highways get built, and if our nation will go to war with another. We could write a list of tens of thousands of examples, if not more. In addition to government, we will be learning about politics. Now, your textbook might include a quote for politics from political scientist Harold Laswell as, quote, who gets what, when, and how. We will be taking an in-depth look at the political process in America in further lessons. For now, you can think of politics as how the government gets elected and establishes public policy. As you hopefully already know, there are 3 branches of government: the executive, legislative, and judicial. And these branches exist on 3 different levels: national, state, and local. The sharing of power and checks and balances of these 3 branches, which we'll look at in much more detail, will play a major role in the operations of our governments. According to Laswell and many political scientists, we must look at the role political power plays in government. So let's get some definitions. Power is the ability to direct or influence the behavior of others. Authority is the right to use power. And with authority, we must think about whether it's legitimate. Political legitimacy is political authority established by law or by state and U.S. constitutions. Debates over how much power and authority should be given to the federal and state governments have divided Americans since its founding. We will look at these debates in later lessons when we discuss the Constitutional Convention, Federalist versus Anti-Federalist, and various political parties, including the Democrats and Republicans today. And this leads to our first standards for the AP exam, which we will use for our first couple of lessons. Today we're going to cover representative democracies and 3 models of contemporary theory on democracy, as well as some basics. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a wide variety of materials are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers. So let's begin to look at how we are governed, and some questions that we will need to answer, which are whether the United States is a democracy or a republic, who rules our government, and what theories exist about how government operates. If you ask most Americans what type of government we have, most of them would say a democracy. Some, however, would disagree, saying that we have a republic, quote unquote, and to the republic for which it stands. So which one is it? Well, technically we have both, but our definition of democracy has changed over the years. Democracy dates back to the 4th century BC, which Greek philosopher Aristotle defined as rule of the many. Ancient Athens had what's called a direct democracy, in which all citizens voted on laws and governmental policies. However, by citizens, they meant male property owners, excluding women, foreigners, and slaves, a formula that would be followed at the founding of the United States. Although the tradition of direct democracies exists in parts of American governments, such as New England town meetings and state referendums which let the electorate vote on laws, America is based on a republican form of government. A republic means that rather than having the population vote on laws and policies, Americans vote on elected officials to accomplish this, and this is called representative democracy. Our definition of a representative democracy is a government in which leaders make decisions for the people. So why do we have a representative democracy and not a direct democracy in which the people decide laws and policies? Well, the first argument for a representative democracy or a republic is that we have too large of a population that is too spread out to get everyone involved in the governing of our country, states, or cities. In ancient Athens, with a voting population of around 30 to 50,000 citizens from a population of around 250,000, direct democracy worked. However, most consider this unrealistic in a population of more than 300 million Americans, or even cities that dwarf the population of ancient Greece. It's also argued that direct democracy doesn't work in the US because most Americans live busy lives and lack the expertise, time, and in many cases, interest to decide complex legislative and policy intricacies. After all, how many of us are up to date on agricultural subsidies or complex trade agreements? The Founding Fathers certainly did not believe the average Americans were up to the task of making governmental decisions. The word democracy is not in the Constitution, and most of the framers of the U.S. Constitution spoke out against the will of the people and their probability of making bad decisions. Yes, they wanted, quote-unquote, the people to have a voice in government, but they differed in their opinions of how much of a voice to give them. To the Founding Fathers, the masses of America's farmers lacked the education, and they feared that they were too uninformed to make sound political decisions. As Thomas Jefferson said, quote, democracy is nothing more than mob rule. We see their apprehension for a purely democratic government in their decision to create an electoral college to choose the executive for the country and a Senate that was chosen mostly by state legislatures when creating the U.S. Constitution. Slowly, however, America's Republican form of government would expand to encompass the belief that almost all American citizens should participate in the political process, to the point where now the words democracy and republic are often used interchangeably. So let's look at how democracy works and who holds the power in our government, something we continually debate. Our Republican form of government relies heavily on our representatives respecting the interests of those who got them elected. The idea is that the, quote, will of the people will be carried out in the competitions or elections for our votes. So who holds the power in a representative democracy? The traditional democratic theory, or as your benchmark might call it, participatory democracy, emphasizes broad participation in politics and a civil society. Participatory democracy also relies on two other major principles: majority rule and minority rights. Majority rule is the political principle that a majority, usually 50% plus one, have the power to make decisions for the whole, and those decisions must be respected. However, those in the minority still have rights that must be protected, such as freedom of speech and freedom to assemble or protest. The traditional participatory theory of democracy is based on the premise that the desires of the people will be carried out by their elected representatives. However, theorists and average Americans disagree to the extent that this actually takes place. There are three contemporary theories of American democracy that you will need to know: pluralist democracy, elite democracy, and hyperpluralism. These theories provide more context for how policies and laws are really created in America, as opposed to just representatives carrying out the will of the people. Pluralist theory is the idea that groups with shared interest influence public policy by pressing their concerns through organized efforts. The concept is that interest groups such as the NAACP or the National Rifle Association and AARP will compete with one another to influence their representatives to pass legislation and policies that will benefit their members. Pluralists are optimistic that a balance will be reached that will best serve the public interest through a continuous process of bargaining amongst the various competing groups. They also argue that political power is so widespread that no portion of society will be able to monopolize power. James Madison expressed this idea in his Federalist Essay number 10, in which he addressed the dangers of factions and political parties. To Madison, America's sheer size with diverse regional interests and factions would counterbalance each other's demands. However, some political theorists think that competing interests have gotten too powerful, making it impossible to accomplish anything. And this is called hyperpluralism, and it creates what is known as political gridlock, something Washington has been especially accused of recently. The pluralist theory of politics has also been criticized for being too optimistic by not taking into account the oversized influence of corporate interests and those of the wealthy, as well as the fact that Americans do not participate in interest groups, such as labor unions, in the numbers that they used to. And this leads to our last theory on politics and government, which is the elite or class theory. The theory of elite quote-unquote democracy contends that power in our political system is divided among class lines. Those with wealth, the upper class, corporations, or elite, will rule. The idea of elite theory, producing what is known as a plutocracy or rule by the wealthy, has been increasingly debated in campaign finance regulation discussions. These are limits on how much money an individual or corporation can give to a candidate. The 2010 Supreme Court decision known as Citizens United helped launch the creation of what are known as super PACs, organizations which allow individuals or corporations to donate incredibly large sums of money to political campaigns. Elitism has led to the belief that representatives are influenced by these large donations to create policies and regulations that benefit large donors. Many in America feel that their vote lacks value in comparison with corporate powers and those of the elite, leading to voter apathy or a lack of interest. This is especially true among young voters, a group that is the least likely to participate in the political process, despite the fact that this is the group that will be most affected in the future by current public policies. We will look at all of these debates in much greater detail down the road, but before we do, let's review. What do you call plans that governments create and implement that are intended to help the people? Public policies. What type of government does the United States have? A representative democracy or a republic. This ancient civilization is known for creating democracy. Ancient Athens. How did their democracy differ from that of the United States? They had a direct democracy in which all citizens participated in policy making and laws. What arguments are used for why a direct democracy would not work in a country like the United States? Well, we are too large, both population-wise and geographically. We're also too busy, and we often lack expertise and interest in governmental policy. This principle states that 50% plus one will usually decide public policy. Majority rule. Which theory states that the wealthy and corporate interests dominate politics? Elite or class theory. This theory contends that power is so widespread amongst various interests that the public good will ultimately be served. Pluralism. Which age group is least likely to vote? Young adults. And that's it. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe because up next we are going to look at foundation principles and documents. And just